I now have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Henry McCoy. I'm just going to take a statement that I thought was outstanding about his expertise and his leadership from the project that he is leading called Haiti Reborn. Dr. McCoy is considered by many as the leading thinker and researcher in the area of inclusive and equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. He is faculty at North Carolina Central University in the business school. He has appointments at a number of other prestigious universities that you can see in the program. But not only an academic, bringing those ideas to the real world in all sorts of different ways. I see his name on lots of different activities over the past year in trying to sustain and help small Black-owned businesses thrive here in Durham. I first met Dr. McCoy when I was the interim project director for the light rail project while working at Go Triangle. And we were looking for support from the community, specifically the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People. And Dr. McCoy is one of the leaders of had been the chair of the Economic Development Committee or subcommittee of that organization. He understood the job potential, the job growth potential of that. But one of the cautions that I took away from that was that coming and making that ask and developing that relationship that late in the game is not the best way to build trust and from the ground level make sure that the interests of their community are embedded in the work that we're doing, and in that case, in the project. And so go forward about a year, and I was executive director of Bike Durham and knew that the Durham Transit Plan was being developed. And the first person I really reached out to was Henry to talk about the opportunity that's there to continue to deliver on the promise that the light rail project had for jobs for local Black residents, and knew that we needed to start at the ground level before we had a set of policies that we wanted to advocate for. So I've been appreciative of the support and the partnership that our organization has been able to develop with the Durham Committee, and the relationship that I've been able to have with Henry, learning more about the work that he's doing. And now that we're able to see people in person a little bit more, I look forward to more of that. Please come to this stage, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning, everybody. So I appreciate, I want to thank John and for that kind introduction, and it has been great, working with him and looking at the work that can be done. Heidi, who is, been very, really, laying the foundation for this event, I know, for a while, and reaching out and trying to get everything coordinated. So thank Heidi, Terry, for the work, and I thank all you all for being part of here. And so, I don't know if I call this presentation, I'm kind of like the warm-up act for the main show, right? And so I get a chance to kind of get the crowd going. And I really want to thank, BikeWalkNC. I'm a former board member of NC Rail Trails, and I do about 35, 40 pounds ago, I was a runner, actually. I ran track in college, and so I still, to this day, run the American Tobacco Trail. Occasional biker. I did the race across America some years ago, and so I think this is such an important and critical conversation. I spent some time in the Department of Commerce, and this is one of the things that we thought about as we thought about the state and how to make the state a place that is welcoming for all folks. And so I just want to take a little bit of time today to I think my task is to do kind of an introduction to Durham, kind of lay the foundation where I think really does have a great, it's a great segue into Dr. Crockett's talk about, her work and things of that nature. But I wanted to give you a little introduction about Durham, and particularly in terms of thinking about where you are right now. So I'm a born and raised North Carolinian. I'm not from Durham, I'm from Fayetteville. Fayetteville is about an hour and 15 minutes away from here. My dad was military, but both my parents were born and raised in the Fayetteville area, so we stayed there while he did his tours of duty and things of that nature. However, I do have a pretty much lifelong connection with Durham. I had family here, and so really summertimes, holidays, things of that nature, I would come to Durham, and I would stay this summer with cousins and things of that nature. And what is now that I know now is the historic Hayti community. I kind of start there and then I go back because I think perspective is an important thing. When I was a kid, I came to Durham and all I saw around me seemed like poverty and despair, right? I mean, I would spend that time in a public housing project here that my family stayed in. And, it's one of those interesting things where, you grow up and you say, well, I don't know exactly what I want to do when I grow up, but I know what I don't want to do. I mean, you have that kind of conversation. Well, that was kind of my conversation with where I want to live, right? I said, I don't know where I want to live at, but I don't want to live in Durham. And lo and behold, I've been here for now, I guess 20, actually as a resident of Durham for 24 years. And I think what the perspective that I speak about is, I think really this idea of as you grow older and you go through life, you realize that every place you go, right, there are places that, are challenged in the community. There's places that are, look very shiny. I learned whenever I got into government and business and things of that nature, when you go to these towns, they like to take you to the shiny places, right, and say, hey, look at where we are. But I always ask to go to the other places, right? Show me the other side of the community. And so I want to give you a little context of Durham and kind of where you sit. So as John mentioned, like the rest of America, this originally was the land of Native Americans, and so I kind of grounded in that. For all practical purposes, the Civil War essentially ended in Durham, and I'll give you some context of that, and that ends up becoming important to the overall story. In order to understand kind of where we are right now, it's important to understand where we've been, right? To understand the kind of the fall, you have to understand the rise. And so I want to give some context of that. The reason I say that the Civil War practically ended in Durham is because one of the last of the largest surrenders happened in Durham. So about a month or so before the end of the Civil War, one of the largest surrenders of the South happened here in Durham. I was a banker for a number of years. So the beginning of my career, I was a banker. It was the kind of heyday, the 90s, when banks were merging and things of that nature. And it's funny because when I was a kid, I always had a lot of energy, right? I like to be up, I like to be active and things of that nature. And, I remember I would in kindergarten, things like that, you lay out the mat, you have to go to take a nap or whatever the case. I pretty much laid there with my eyes closed, but I wasn't asleep, right? Because I was like ready to get up and going. Well, when you get older, you kind of hope for naps during the day, right? I mean, you kind of say, hey, maybe I can catch a nap. So when I was in banking, there was a little place about a quarter mile from where the banking headquarters were. It was a headquarters bank here that I worked at. The bank has now grown up to become SunTrust and Truist and all these kind of things, but it was a little community bank at the time called Central Carolina Bank. So I was working, and I would take my lunch break sometimes and go down to this what looked like a little old rugged shed or something, and it had a little fence around it and a parking lot. It didn't look like much. I'd go there, I'd park, and I'd take a nap for about 30 minutes and go up the street, go back to work. What I learned later was that place was actually Bennett Memorial Farm. And so Bennett Memorial Farm is the place that the surrender that I mentioned happened toward the end of the Civil War. And the reason why that comes into play is because, this is 1865, and so, the surrenders take a while, right? So the surrender took about a week, and you had men from all over, at that time, the United States. And in the surrender, you're not fighting. But, men did what men do when they have time on their hands and not a whole lot to do. They got into some trouble, right? I mean, and so they went around and kind of pillaged the community and things of that nature. And so during that week's time, during the surrender, you had essentially particularly the Union soldiers going through, and they wrecked the shop of this guy named John Green, who was a merchant. He had a merchantcy here in Durham. And they tore the place apart, they robbed him, all these kind of things, and they kind of left him for broke. The Civil War, so that week is over, the surrender's done, and the fighting goes on maybe another month, and then the Civil War is over. Well, one of the things that these Union soldiers and some Confederate soldiers ended up kind of taking from this merchant Green was tobacco. And it was this kind of unique tobacco. It was yellowish because of the soil of kind of how it grew here, which is where the name golden leaf comes from. It was a yellowish, things of that nature. These individuals ended up going back to their communities. Again, this is a national war, so they go back to their communities. And the same guy that they basically ran into bankruptcy from pillaging his store, they started writing back to him saying, hey, do you mind, can we get some more of that tobacco? And so that ended up laying the foundation for what we ended up having here in Durham as a tobacco-driven economy, because this kind of smooth tobacco that then actually had a national market because of the fact that the soldiers here were from all over the country whenever they stole it. And so that ended up creating the rise of what would become Durham. Now, again, you have this major surrender. You have the end of the Civil War. Durham also, a place called Stagville, had one of the largest plantations here in the South. Nearly 1,000 slaves that at the end of the Civil War, now what do? This ain't today where you might jump in the car and take off someplace. You might say, I want to get as far away from there as I can. Folks were pedestrian, right? There weren't a whole lot of ways to get around. So essentially what happened was this land that this building sits in and around was essentially land that were taken from the Native Americans. The white folks took control of it, took ownership of it, but it wasn't like the best land. And so you hear this story over and over again, right? The places in the communities that are floodplains and not the best places, they end up in essentially where the black community lived. And so originally the black community started after slavery leasing land from the white community. And sooner or later, enough of those former slaves from the Stagville plantation started locating here. The white folks said, we don't really want it anyway, so they started settling the land. And so that became the foundation for what this community is. The community is called, historically, it's called the Historic Hayti community. Hayti, H-A-Y-T-I. And those who know history, Haiti as the nation originally spelled its name H-A-Y-T-I. I use that as a foundation and framework for thinking about this context of where you are, because if you know the history, Haiti is the only nation on the planet created from essentially a slave revolt that was successful. They beat Napoleon's army, took over control of the nation, which is why of course they speak French and things of that nature. And so I say that to say that think about just how much your ambition has to be for a small black community here in the southern part of the United States to name itself after the first and only nation state created on the planet from a slave revolt. So that foundation really serves as a basis for what would become the Hayti community, the proud Hayti community. Haiti essentially changed its spelling to H-A-I-T-I, which is what we know it to be now. Hayti kept the H-A-Y-T-I. And so the Hayti community was born. And over the course of, from the late part of the 19th century, so slavery in 1865, for probably around 1880 is whenever what became the storied history of Hayti really started growing. Like a lot of other black communities, the original foundation were churches. White Rock Baptist Church, St. Joseph's Church, which both churches exist to this day. They served as kind of the convening point in the growth of the overall community. What essentially happened over the next century really ended up being somewhat miraculous in terms of the expansion of the Haiti community. What you end up having over time was the creation of a community ecosystem, and I use ecosystem in a real sense to understand that it wasn't just kind of one or two things. It wasn't, oh, well, that was they had some houses that had this and that. I mean, it was truly an economic ecosystem that rose here. And I start kind of with a year 1898, and then move kind of quickly forward, just because I think that gives some interesting dichotomy to the society that we live in, the state that we live in, and the contrast sometimes that we live in, even up to today. So 1898, for those who know of North Carolina history, was the year of what became known as the Wilmington Race Massacre. It's the only coup d'etat in U.S. history that happened in Wilmington, which is Wilmington is about 120 miles from here. Essentially, what was going on was that during Reconstruction, you had these kind of different alliances that were coming together because you had a sense of, well, if black folks can get the vote, it's going to be allowed to vote, then who's going to benefit from the idea that black folks now have the vote, specifically black men. And so there was this fusion coalition that came together of blacks and whites down in Wilmington, North Carolina. At the time, Wilmington was one of the leading cities for black business entrepreneurship. Like many other places, it's a port city. So during that time period, the late 19th century, a lot of commerce happened at the port level. And the black folks in Durham, in Wilmington, were really economically well off. To a certain extent. They had businesses, and there was a newspaper, and so a bunch of the debate that ended up serving as the foundation for this race massacre was an editorial that was written about this contrast between the idea of the white community, and particularly white men, pushing against this idea of basically intercourse between whites and blacks. Whenever there was such a long history of white males raping black women and things of that nature, that editorial ended up in the local newspaper, and that was just kind of it was a spark, kind of like that happened in Tulsa. It wasn't essentially just that; it was kind of planned before that. So in 1898, hundreds of folks, black folks in Wilmington, North Carolina, about 120 miles from here, were displaced from their home. Their businesses were burnt. They were essentially ran out of Wilmington. And really from 1898 until probably the middle of the 20th century, did not recover in a lot of ways from a standpoint of political activity and things of that nature. That same year, 1898, as this massacre was going on, here in Durham, North Carolina Mutual Insurance was incorporated. In North Carolina Mutual Insurance, you can still, I don't know kind of where the tour is going to be today, but you might end up seeing the Mutual building on this tour. And I mention that because North Carolina Mutual would go on to become the world's largest black business. Not Durham's largest black business, not North Carolina's largest black business, not America's but the world's largest black business for much of the 20th century. And that itself laid the foundation for what became the storied Hayti, as well as the tobacco story I told you, right? So you got this marketplace that's created from essentially the surrender, the end of the Civil War. You now have a national market kind of from day one because folks went back and said, hey, that's some pretty good tobacco. Can we get some? The John Green merchant who went bankrupt because his facility was torn to pieces, then soon after became the richest man in Durham because all these people write back and say, hey, send me that tobacco. That then say, okay, this is a marketplace here. At the time, Durham was kind of the stepchild of the triangle, and from time to time, it served in that role, at different times. Because during this time period, the center of education was Chapel Hill, the first publicly chartered university in the country, 1789. So education was Chapel Hill, which is Orange County. In Raleigh, you had the state capital, so you had government. So everything government operated. Durham was essentially carved out of those two counties, Wake County and Orange County, to create Durham County. But for a while, it didn't have any identity. Well, commerce became its identity, and that came about because this tobacco market started growing. And so you had these tobacco processors that kind of showed up. They weren't really processors. They were generally tobacco farmers who were trying to be a part of the marketplace. One of those individuals ended up being Washington Duke, the namesake of Duke University, who came over, who had grown up, poor, he came over to Durham. And so all of these things happening together, create this kind of enormous rise of the local economy. And so tobacco becomes a global market, right? Because it's addictive. You start using, you get nicotine, you want more. It starts growing. That lays the foundation for what Durham becomes. There were not enough white people in Durham to essentially serve as a workforce to satisfy that huge demand. And so that then opens the door for the black community to have jobs, so much so that there was a time period where the black community got together right up the street here at a place. It's not a historic, it's the Hayti Heritage Center, but at that time it was the St. Joseph Church. The black community got together because they were saying, well, look, we're being kept out of jobs. The individual who is often said to incite the race massacre in Wilmington was a guy named Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels was the editor of the News and Observer newspaper, which still exists today. Most people think about it as a state newspaper. At the time, Josephus Daniels, who was the editor of that paper, he was a rabid white supremacist. So he used his paper to really drive that action in Wilmington and things of that nature. Well, he also used that paper to say things like no self-respecting business leader would ever give a job to a black person that should go to a white person. No self-respecting business would ever allow black people and white people to work side by side. I mean, that's what was in the editorial at the time. And so for a really decent period of time, black folks were totally kind of shut out of that economy. Well, but with the tobacco industry growing, by this time, Washington Duke is really the leading tobacco merchant, and he had formulated a relationship. You can call it friendship, you can call it all kinds of things with his barber, John Merrick, a former slave who had actually relocated from Wilmington. John Merrick had been a brick mason. He had been a barber. He was Washington Duke's barber, but he was in Raleigh. Now, keep in mind, this is the end of the 19th century. So, getting from Durham to Raleigh, which is now 15, 20-minute ride on the highway, at that time was like a day's journey, right, to get there. And so Washington Duke wanted his barber to be here in Durham. So he starts selling him on the idea of moving to Durham. John Merrick ultimately comes to Durham and opens up 6 barbershops, 3 for whites, 3 for African Americans. And Washington Duke was his primary customer. And again, they built a relationship. And so that relationship between this super wealthy white merchant and this black former slave barber ended up laying a foundation for what would rise here in the Hayti community. And so whenever the black community got together to basically say, we've had enough, right? We got to get out of Durham because we can't get opportunity. You got Josephus Daniels and News and Observer writing editorials saying, don't give black folks jobs, things of that nature. John Merrick at this kind of midnight meeting at the St. Joseph's Church said, look, you all just wait a minute. Let me try to work on this. He goes and sees Washington Duke and talks to him about it, right? Now Washington Duke, depending on kind of the story that you hear, he talks about his feelings for helping black folks came from kind of a charge from God. I mean, as a Christian, that he should be helping black folks. He talked about the fact that he grew up very poor, and so he feels like as long as individuals put the work in, he feels like that they should benefit from that. So that becomes part of the lore. Also, he has some self-interest. I mean, he was again the leading merchant in tobacco. He needed workers, and so he didn't want really this potential workforce to disappear like so many other blacks that were going up to the north. And so that was kind of a part of it. There also some lore that part of the reason why the Duke family, or part of the reason why they invested so much in the black Hayti community was that there were a few browner skinned Dukes running around here that they were investing in a broader sense. And so all that kind of went into play. Whatever the case, what came out of that was that Washington Duke essentially opened up his factories to black workers. And black workers, they did from, at different times work side by side with white workers. They were still getting a lot of times the worst jobs. I mean, so I want to be kind of true about that. They were getting the worst jobs. They weren't necessarily paid the same amount, but they were working. And so what essentially came about from that combination was, yeah, black folks now working in the factory in this growing economy, and to get some sense of just how big American Tobacco, which is Washington Duke's company, was. I try to put this in perspective. There's only been a few companies in American history that have been broken up for antitrust. AT&T was, all the baby bells got broken up. Microsoft almost was, because folks said it got too big. Standard Oil, of course, John D. Rockefeller was broken up. That's how you end up with all these mobile ones and BPs and things like that. American Tobacco was another. So the way you ended up with like Liggett Myers and R.J. Reynolds and all these kind of things was American Tobacco was so big that the government came in and broke it up. The other context for that is that I did some research and I found the first, now everybody, a lot of folks look to see who's going to be on the 400 richest American list, right? Well, the first list came out in 1917. And to give you some context of just kind of how wealthy the Duke family was, they were on that first list, right? You had it's like a who's who, right? You had John Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Eastman, who started Kodak. All these folks on this list, and Duke. So that's how wealthy they were. So anyway, you had this rise of this global marketplace. You had black folks now being able to work in the factory, get money. They then would come across a railroad track, because it was, literally the railroad track split the black and the white community. They were able to come across a railroad track, and they would kind of business savvy enough to say, we're going to create enterprises over here that essentially can capture this money. And that's what happened. And that was the growth, was this idea that entrepreneurship would serve as a foundation for this work, that as the black community worked in the tobacco warehouses and textile mills, Julian Carr, who is the notorious white racist, was also an investor in the Haiti black community. A little different reason than Duke. Julian Carr felt more like, well, if we can make sure the black folks are, somewhat happy over there, they won't want to come over here and integrate with us. So he invested in the black community as well. All that was happening in a way that really was driving the overall growth of the Haiti community. So over the course of from the end of the 19th century to essentially the middle of the 20th century, Haiti grew to become this kind of hub for black business growth. And certainly, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a competition. There was a number of black Wall Streets around. There were a number of black Wall Streets around the United States. Tulsa, Oklahoma is probably the one that most people know, particularly, with the history of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Just celebrated 100 years of the destruction of that community. And really, Tulsa and Durham kind of battled it out for a while around supremacy of, kind of the Black Wall Street. Tulsa was driven by oil the same way tobacco was driving here in Durham. Well, in 1921, whenever Tulsa was burned and bombed and destroyed, then Durham at that point kind of became this de facto kind of Black Wall Street that remained here. And so at that time, over the course of its history, it had been known as the capital of the black middle class. Durham was. More black millionaires per capita than any other place in the United States were here in Durham. They called it the city on the hill for black folks. In fact, Durham was a net gainer of black folks in a time when the Great Migration was happening. So the 6 million or so blacks that moved up north, black folks were getting on trains coming to Durham. And it goes back that sense of this idea of naming yourself after Haiti. I often think about the fact that it feels like the people here in the Haiti community felt like they were creating an island in the middle of a southern racist society where black people could have some level of freedom, some level of prosperity. And for some people who know the history, Booker T. Washington and W. Du Bois at one point were friends. They then were not. They then had very big differences because W. Du Bois, who was never in slavery, was born up north, became Harvard's first black PhD, those kind of things, believed in integration. He believed in freedom and voting and all these kind of things. Booker T. Washington, who had grown up in slavery, was like, well, look, I don't need to vote. We don't need integration. Just essentially, hire us to do the business work that we've been doing as slaves, and we're fine. So that's where they kind of went in disparate ways. Booker T. Washington came to Durham in 1910 because he kept hearing about, you got to go to this place in Durham, or you think this is something, you ought to go to Durham. So Booker T. Washington came to Durham in 1910. W. Du Bois came to Durham in 1911. When they left, they each in separate essays talked about just how miraculous the city was. And so that's the one thing that they ultimately agreed on, was that Durham was the most miraculous city they saw for black folks. Tobacco factories and the largest brick developer was a black man. I mean, all these kind of things. I want to go back to North Carolina Mutual very quickly as I kind of wrap up and kind of talk about kind of what happened, and I think that is in some ways laid the foundation for Carolyn's talk. But North Carolina Mutual, as I mentioned, ended up being a centerpiece for what would become the rise of Black Durham. And it really is kind of instructive of how wealth is created these days. So that money that was being made across the railroad track, you have black folks that were setting up businesses here in Durham, to some estimates, up to 500 black businesses in all different kind of industries were created. NC Mutual was created essentially as an insurance company because black folks couldn't be honored in death. White folks didn't want to bury her. And so, black folks came together in this kind of mutual aid society, say, hey, we can put our money together, and when somebody dies, we'll help bury you. NC Mutual grew out of that aspect. But just like today, right, all of us, insurance is one of those kind of very, very interesting businesses, right? Because it's like the business it's like the bill you pay that you kind of don't want to have to ever kind of call in. Like, you pay car insurance every month, but you don't really want to file a claim because you don't want to get in a wreck. And so it's like a business that takes money and tries not to pay it back out. Well, with mutual savings or with mutual insurance, these were like very small life insurance policies. So if somebody died, you bury them, which you can go, that's going to happen, right, sooner or later. But there's a float, right? It's kind of the Warren Buffett way, right? You get the money now, you hope not to have to spend it till later, so you invest it in the meantime. NC Mutual, in a lot of ways, served as this kind of centerpiece of like a venture capital fund for entrepreneurship in Durham. People would pay you hear stories about, the mutual agents going around, knocking on the door and paying, folks paying their $1, a week or whatever for these policies. And then they would come back to Mutual and they would be in the coffers, and Mutual basically reinvested that money in the community. And so that created this kind of foundation for the ecosystem that became the business landscape. That ultimately is what led to the rise of Black Durham, and it ended up inspiring communities all around. Mutual opened businesses in all kind of different black communities. What became Soul City, which is actually a real city. I tell my students that, they're like, what? Soul City? You making that up? No, there's a Soul City here in North Carolina that was inspired by Durham. But then, of course, a number of things happened around the mid 20th century. Everything from just the kind of constant decay of the community. Integration was happening. Of course, you had, the civil rights integration that ended up being kind of economically one way, where, money went out to black community, it didn't kind of come in. And you had urban renewal, right? This sense of, going into the communities and revitalize them. And so that essentially ended up being a death knell for the Haiti community. So those communities that did not get destroyed by racial violence, that were, like the Tulsa, Oklahomas, the Wilmington, North Carolinas, you had, in the Red Summer of 1919, had like 40 communities that were destroyed from racial violence. The ones that did not get destroyed that way ended up largely getting destroyed through urban renewal. The I-95 that we love so much went through Jackson Ward in Richmond. Same thing happened in Birmingham, I-5 in LA. Here it was 147. So the highway that some of you might have come on went right through the middle of Durham's black community. By some estimates, it ended up destroying about 4,000 homes, about 500 businesses that were largely around here in the Haiti community, which then led to kind of an exodus of folks who could leave. So kind of that middle class that was here, black middle class, as integration of neighborhoods happened, those individuals were able to move out, leaving the folks behind that were the least able to move out, or those that were just committed and they wouldn't move out. And what we've seen is a decline of all kinds of capital during that time period. I mean, for the last 60 years since the highway came through, social capital, entrepreneur, economic capital, human capital, all those kind of things, which has kind of led to, this being essentially the poorest zip code in Durham at this point. NCCU is one of the remaining anchor institutions that is still around where I work at North Carolina Central University. NC Mutual, for all practical purposes, is in default and under control of the state. A number of the other banks and things like that have shut down. And so it's interesting when I stand in front of my students and say, hey, you can be great business folks. And I said, this was a business hub. They say, what this? I mean, what happened? And I always say, I might as well start out these stories with, once upon a time, and end it with they lived happily ever after, but they didn't live happily ever after, right? And so what I want to kind of leave with that is that, this story can be repeated in a lot of different places across the United States, this kind of destruction of black wealth and destruction of black homes and things of that nature. Promises made that were never fulfilled. There were a lot of promises made about urban renewal that would come about if the black community agreed to some of these projects, did not come about. It's left a lot of pain and anger in the community. There's still folks up around here that have stories about, their homes being destroyed, the highway going through the middle of it, things of that nature. So it's left a lot of pain. John mentioned HR Reborn, which is an effort that I've been leading and pushing, really focused around this idea of how do we invest significant resources into this community in a way that doesn't gentrify it. Economic mobility without gentrification, or at least without forced gentrification. I believe people should have the right to kind of live, want to live right. So I think sometimes we we kind of romanticize the idea of people feeling like people always want to live in the same place, but then people should have that choice. So HR Reborn is really a project that's pulled together folks from the community as kind of basis and foundation, but then beyond that, looks at investing over the course of the next decade $1 billion into development here that is community owned. So a wealth generating opportunity to move the work forward. You can feel free to, if you want to Google, you can Google HR Reborn, HAYTI Reborn.com, or the Durham Global Equity Project, which is associated with it. But the hope is that we can be demonstrative of how you can rebuild a community with the people at the center. So I want to move now to do my introduction of our wonderful speaker, who I think will talk about how some aspects of this idea of what happened when folks show up and ready to run a highway through you or something like that, right? So Carolyn Crockett, Dr. Carolyn Crockett, you have a bio inside of the book, so I'm not going to kind of read it from that standpoint. But she's certainly a leading thinker and scholar in this work around large-scale urban development, right? A couple of degrees from Yale, London School of Economics in between there. We need more minds like Carolyn to work on this work. We were talking earlier. She's born and raised in Boston. She loves Boston so much she brought the weather with her, so that, so she would feel at home today. And I said, well, make sure you take it back with you when you go. But Carolyn, she's had a very incredible career leading as a thinker in this work. Both from the academic and the practitioner side. I always say I don't like to think without doing, but I don't like to do without thinking. And certainly, Carolyn is an embodiment of that. You read about her, the work that she did, getting youth involved in the area, giving tours and being able to get resources from that and what that means for the history that you're embedding in that next generation, but also showing the value of their minds, right? And those kind of things. So has a award-winning program doing that. MIT and that great work there. On the faculty and leading this work around preparing the next generation for what I hope is more equitable planning. She served in the Boston local government for a number of years in economic development, and then she became their first chief equity officer, which is such a distinguished honor because it's so important to have folks in these roles who understand in a very broad way how to do this work. Again, understand both at a theoretical level and at a practical level. When I talk to mayors, mostly, and I had the chance to work some with Mayor Walsh in Boston, through some of my work at Harvard and things of that nature. Mayors always want to, they always want to know kind of, well, what do I need to do? What are the 1 or 2 things I need to do this work, do that work, and and how do we move this forward? And my statement back then was always, well, hey, Mayor, I'm happy to tell you some things that you can do, but it wasn't 1 or 2 things that got us here. It's not going to be 1 or 2 things that gets us out of here. It's going to be something much more than that. And so I think that, it's wonderful that we have folks like, Carolyn to work on this, to help bring all those different thoughts together. How do you work on the next generation, the current work, and all these kind of things as we move forward? And so without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Carolyn Crockett to the stage to enlighten us with her work. Thank you.
At HDR, we're passionate about making North Carolina a better place to walk and roll. Our Salem Parkway project in Winston-Salem upgraded a downtown greenway, integrated a bike and pedestrian tunnel into a highway reconstruction project, and delivered 2 signature bridges. From planning to construction, we're ready to help you imagine, design, and deliver the next generation of bicycle and pedestrian projects for our communities.
Hi, I'm Lisa Regal with AARP North Carolina. We enjoy working with BikeWalkNC as we work to make our active transportation safer through efforts like the Bicycle Safety Quiz, Vision Zero, and Complete Streets.